I was a coward, and the worst kind of coward at that, because on the day I disappeared, I left behind everything that ever mattered. Texas summers have a way of making a man feel small. The heat presses down on you like a weight, and the dust settles into every crease of your skin. It was the kind of summer where the roads shimmered under the sun, where the hum of cicadas filled the air, and where I made the worst mistake of my life. I was 22 years old, working at my father's auto shop, trying to scrape together a life that felt bigger than the one I had. The shop sat right at the edge of town, a simple building with its rusted Dawson auto repair sign barely hanging on. My father ran it with the kind of discipline that only old-school men had. Tough, no nonsense, but fair. And then there was Linda. She wasn't just beautiful. She was the kind of woman who made you believe in things, like staying put, like building a future. She had this way of laughing that made you feel like the only person in the world, and when she looked at you, really looked at you, it was like she could see straight through all the nonsense and into who you really were. I wanted to give her something that proved I was more than just another small-town boy with grease under his nails. And that's how I ended up standing in front of my father's register with 50 trembling dollars in my hands. It was just supposed to be a small thing, a necklace with a tiny blue sapphire. Nothing extravagant, but enough to make her eyes light up. But when I slipped the money into my pocket, it felt heavier than I expected. I didn't get away with it. My father knew his books too well, and by the next morning, he was standing in front of me with that quiet kind of disappointment that cut deeper than yelling ever could. "Tell me it wasn't you, Frank." I couldn't. I thought maybe he'd hit me, maybe he'd throw me out. Instead, he just let out a breath, like something inside him deflated. "You ain't the man I thought you were." That was worse than any punishment he could have given me. And so instead of facing it, facing him, facing Linda, facing myself, I ran. That night, I packed a bag, stole another couple $100 from the shop, because when you've already ruined your life, what's a little more damage, and got on the first Greyhound bus out of town. I never looked back. For years, I convinced myself that leaving was the only choice, that staying would have meant endless shame, that my father would never forgive me, that Linda would have moved on anyway. But the past has a way of catching up, no matter how far you go. I spent the next 50 years trying to outrun the ghost of my old life. I worked in diners, fixed cars in roadside garages, even did a stint washing dishes in a casino kitchen. I never stayed in one place too long. Never let anyone get too close. And yet, no matter where I went, Texas followed me. Every time I saw a girl with golden hair, my heart would stutter, wondering if she looked anything like Linda now. Every time I passed an auto shop, I'd hear my father's voice in my head, reminding me of all the things I could have been. But I kept moving, until one day fate, or maybe just plain bad luck, put me face to face with a version of myself I had long tried to forget. It was a freezing morning in New York, the kind where the wind cuts straight through your coat and into your bones. I was sitting in a diner, nursing a burnt cup of coffee, when a kid at the counter caught my eye. He couldn't have been more than 20, all jittery energy and nervous glances. "I just need $20, the kid was saying to the cashier, his voice laced with desperation. "I swear, I'll pay it back." The cashier sighed. "No handouts, kid." And just like that, the boy grabbed a handful of bills from the tip jar and bolted. I don't know what made me chase after him. Maybe it was because, in that moment, I saw myself, the same panic, the same bad decision made in a moment of weakness. I caught up to him in an alleyway 2 blocks down. "Not gonna get far like that," I said, leaning against the brick wall. The kid flinched, clutching the crumpled bills. "Look, I ain't here to turn you in," I interrupted. "But if you're gonna ruin your life, at least do it for a better reason than $20. His shoulders slumped. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the ground. And for the first time in 50 years, I told someone the truth. I told him about Texas, about my father's shop, about the $50 and the necklace and the girl I had loved but never fought for. By the time I was finished, the kid was looking at me like I had just handed him the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. "You ever go back?" he asked. "No. Why not?" I let out a breath, the cold air turning to fog. Because I was a coward then. And maybe I still am. The kid was quiet for a long time. Then, to my surprise, he stood up, stuffed the stolen money back into his pocket, and walked back toward the diner. I watched him go, something heavy settling in my chest. And that's when it hit me. Maybe it was time. Maybe it was time to stop running. Coming back to Texas felt like walking into a memory I wasn't sure I belonged to anymore. The roads had changed. The storefronts weren't the same. But the feeling, that thick, heavy summer air, the scent of fried food and motor oil, the way the cicadas hummed like they were whispering old secrets, none of that had changed. Neither had my nerves. I stood outside what used to be my father's shop, staring up at the sign, Henderson and Dawson Auto Repair. The Dawson part nearly knocked the wind out of me. I had expected the place to be gone, replaced by something new, forgotten like I had been. But here it was, my name still hanging up there, like some part of me had never really left. I hesitated. 50 years was a long time. What if no one remembered me? Worse, what if they did? Before I could decide whether to turn and run, a voice rang out behind me. Well, I'll be damned. I knew that voice. I turned slowly, and there she was. Linda. 50 years older, but still Linda. The golden hair had faded to silver, her face lined with time, but those eyes, those deep brown eyes, hadn't changed a bit. And the way she was looking at me, like she wasn't sure whether to hug me or hit me. Frank Dawson, she said, crossing her arms. I thought you were dead. I let out a nervous chuckle. Not yet. She didn't laugh. Silence stretched between us, thick with a half-century of unfinished conversations. Then, finally, she let out a sigh and shook her head. Come on, she said. Might as well come inside. I followed her into the shop, half expecting to see my father standing there, arms crossed, ready to tear into me like I was still 22. But he wasn't there. Of course, he wasn't. Instead, there was a younger man behind the counter. Tall, strong, broad-shouldered. He looked up as we entered, his sharp brown eyes locking onto mine like a heat-seeking missile. His gaze flicked to Linda. Who's this? She hesitated just long enough for something in my gut to twist. Daniel, she said, voice careful. This is Frank Dawson. The young man's face hardened. His jaw clenched. And then he said the words that made my stomach drop. My mother's Frank Dawson? I felt the blood drain from my face. Linda closed her eyes briefly, like she had hoped he wouldn't put the pieces together so quickly. But Daniel wasn't stupid. His hands curled into fists at his sides. His eyes burned into me, filled with something I couldn't quite name. Anger maybe, but something deeper too. You mean to tell me, he said, voice tight, controlled, that you are the man who ran out on my mother 50 years ago? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. And, he continued, stepping forward, you're also the same guy who stole from his own father and skipped town like a damn coward? That word. Coward. I had been running from that word for 50 years, and now it stood right in front of me, wearing my own name like a curse. Linda placed a gentle hand on Daniel's arm. Son, he shook her off, never taking his eyes off me. Why are you here? He demanded. I swallowed hard. Because I'm tired of running. The words felt too small for what I really meant, but they were the only ones I had. Daniel stared at me for a long moment, then, without warning, let out a short, bitter laugh. Well, ain't life funny? He muttered, shaking his head. Because you're looking at the man who now owns the shop you abandoned. And just like that, I realized my past wasn't just catching up to me. It had been waiting for me all along. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. Daniel didn't throw me out. He didn't yell. He just looked at me, like he was trying to decide whether I was worth his time. Then he reached under the counter and tossed me a wrench. If you really want to stop running, you can start by fixing what's in Bay 3, he said. I caught the wrench on instinct. You serious? He shrugged. Figure you ought to work off what you stole. And just like that, I found myself back in my father's shop, my hands covered in grease, the smell of motor oil thick in the air. Except this time, I wasn't some scared kid trying to prove something. This time, I was an old man trying to make things right. Linda visited often. We didn't talk much about the past at first, but one evening she brought me a box. Inside were letters. My letters. The ones I had written but never sent. "I found these in your father's things after he passed," she said softly. "He kept them, Frank. He never stopped waiting for you." I gripped the papers with trembling hands. He had never given up on me. Even after everything. A lump formed in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I had spent a lifetime running from regret. I wasn't about to let it swallow me now. I stayed in town. Daniel and I weren't suddenly family overnight, but he let me work at the shop. Not as charity, not out of pity, but because I earned my place there. And Linda became my friend again. Not like before, not in the way I had once dreamed, but in a way that mattered. A way that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I still had a place in this world. Then one evening, Daniel called me into the shop after closing. "I got something for you," he said. He led me to the wall where an old, rusted sign hung. And beneath it, a brand new plaque had been installed. "Welcome home, Frank Dawson." I stared at it, my vision blurring. I had spent a lifetime searching for peace, for redemption, for some way to fix what I had broken. And now, standing in the place I had once run from, I realized I had found it. Not in apologies, not in making up for lost time, but in simply being here, present, whole, home.